Well, what a pleasure to have Sal Khan here with us. I've been in education personally for about 20 years, and I'm a huge fan, a big admirer. I would say you were one of the pioneers who kicked off this revolution of open access education. So welcome, and thank you for being with us. I thought for the audience today, maybe we would organize things, with your permission, around a little bit of past, a little bit of present, and some future from your perspective. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Great. So we have a lot of entrepreneurs out there. Raise your hand if you're an entrepreneur, please. Okay, so we have a lot of entrepreneurs. So first, let's start with the past. You started Khan Academy. I'm guessing there were some ups and downs. Could you tell us a little bit about your entrepreneurial journey?
Oh, yeah, and mine is a little bit unusual. A lot of folks might know, back in 2004, my day job, a year out of business school, I was an analyst at a hedge fund. But it just came out of conversation that my cousin, who lived 1,500 miles away in New Orleans, I was in Boston at the time, needed help with math. And so I offered to tutor her. I tutor her remotely on the phone at the time and instant messenger, whatever I could find. And slowly but surely, she learned her math, word spread in my family, free tutoring is going on. Before I knew it, I had 10, 15 cousins I was working with. And then I started writing software for them because I saw that they all had gaps. The reason they were struggling wasn't because they weren't bright, it wasn't because they didn't have good teachers, it was because they were in 9th grade and they had forgotten some material from 5th grade, their decimals or fractions. So, and my original background was in tech, so I started writing little software that would generate problems and I could keep track. And one of my friends said, "This software is cool, Sal." It was a hobby. He's like, "But how are you scaling your actual lessons with your cousins?" And I said, "Yeah, it's hard to do with 15 cousins, what I was originally doing with 1 or 2. And he says, "Why don't you record some of your lessons as videos for your family? Put them on YouTube." I said, "No, that's silly. YouTube is for cats playing piano. It is not for real math." But I got over the idea that it wasn't my idea. I gave it a shot. And my cousins famously said that they liked me better on YouTube than in person. And I believe what they were saying is they liked being able to access me whenever they want, as pause, repeat. They didn't have to feel ashamed that they had to review something from a few years ago. And it was also a platform where people who are not my cousins were able to start leveraging, and I started getting letters from folks. This was all while I had the day job. So I was working as an investor, as an analyst at an investment company. And then you fast forward about 5 years from that first tutoring with Nadia to now 2009, and there are about 50 to 100,000 folks who are using these resources, the videos, the practice, every month. And I frankly had trouble focusing on my day job. We looked at our finances. We were saving some money for a down payment on a house, but it felt like the social impact on this could be just off the charts. So set it up as a not-for-profit, mission-free, world-class education for anyone, anywhere, and took the plunge. And I think anytime you do anything entrepreneurial, whether it's for-profit or non-profit, you almost have to start with that delusional optimism. You have to assume that the world will recognize that this is a project worth the resourcing. But as soon as you take the plunge, you realize that the world is maybe not as observant as it should be. I think like a lot of folks, and my journey is a little unusual as being a not-for-profit journey versus a for-profit one, but that first year was incredibly tough. We were living off of savings, and our first child had just been born. But by the end of that year, I took the most naive approach possible. It was kind of like I put my head down and I kept working on it and building and hoping that someone would notice was really my approach. And eventually people did.
So from hedge fund to purpose-driven entrepreneur in education, was there one major bump in the road where you would say was kind of a personal game-changing moment where maybe it was a dark time, a down period?
Oh, well, I think that entire year, my wife and I looked at our finances and we kind of said, okay, maybe we can dig into our savings for about a year. After that point, it would no longer be a down payment on a house. And you can imagine around 9 months into that was the darkest period. Because you're starting to see, well, what am I going to do in 3 months? Will I even be able to get a job that I had before? Will I be able to do it? I had already blown through probably $50,000 or $60,000 in savings. I had gotten rejected by at least 20 or 30 philanthropists at that point. There were some venture capitalists who were interested, but just for what we wanted to do at Khan Academy, what I wanted to do at Khan Academy at the time, it just didn't feel exactly right. And it's sometimes, I guess when the story turns out, it's darkest right before the dawn, I often believe. And so it was right at that time that then all of a sudden a few people started to take notice.
So that's a little bit of the past. Let's move to present. So for those of us interested in education, either entrepreneurs, people in education, what do you see as kind of key forces for change that are happening now or in the near future?
I think a lot of people, obviously we're still kind of surfacing from the pandemic, and the pandemic introduced virtual, distance school, distance learning, et cetera, and I think everyone has had mixed feelings about all of it. But I think the really good thing about the pandemic is that it has introduced, it has put a focal point on this idea of how do you make sure that learning is not bound by time or space, and that how do you make sure that there's always an opportunity and an incentive for people to actually fill in whatever gaps they had. This is something that we at Khan Academy have talked about since the beginning. I saw this with my cousins, is that most kids struggle because they have gaps, and they never get to fill in those gaps. But if you actually allow them to fill in their gaps at their own time and pace, they can do anything they want. The pandemic has finally put a spotlight on that. The pandemic has finally shown people, we have to have a way for people to finish their unfinished learning, to fill in whatever gaps they might have.
And one of the topics for today that was on our list is decentralization. So was Khan Academy decentralization, centralization? I mean, how do you think about it?
Well, education, a lot of people have gotten very cynical about education generally. They think, okay, it's been the same for the last 200 years, even over the last 30 or 40 years, there's been all of this desire to use technology. They'll put iPads in classrooms and they just cross their fingers and they hope that something good happens. And we haven't seen anything budge. So people have become very cynical of what's actually possible with education. I think we're in a mode right now where, right now there's 140 million registered users on Khan Academy. About 30 million come every month. About half of them are in schools, half of them are outside of schools. And so a lot of people are learning on a platform like this. I think the next phase is for them to be able to prove what they know on a platform like this. And so this is what we're working on right now. The pandemic has shown that you need to give people opportunity not just to learn, but also to prove what they know. So I'm hoping that we're going to be able to, we're already doing a pilot where students are getting mastery on Khan Academy, they're getting free college credit, they're getting free high school credit. So these things that traditionally cost thousands and thousands of dollars, I think the pandemic has opened people's minds to saying, hey, maybe there's ways to deliver it to people that's close to free.
So one thing I'm wondering is if we go back to television, for example, when television arrived, people said, look, this is going to change everything. We're going to have shared information, democratization, all these kinds of things. You could argue there was some of that, but television has actually not fully delivered on that promise. Same thing with the internet, right? I mean, the internet was going to democratize everything. Everyone was going to be connected. And we are, but then we have big tech that are, a massive concentration of power and control. So what do you see happening in education? I mean, are there going to be dominant educational platforms? Are we going to have big ed? Or are we going to have blockchain that's going to decentralize many things about education?
Well, I think there's two things. I think you're absolutely right. When the radio first came out, people were saying, oh, the radio is going to transform education. We'll put the best lecturers on the radio and then everyone will have. Obviously, it didn't happen. No. When the TV came out, people said the same thing. It did happen a little bit. You had some educational programming, things like Sesame Street and other things that did help on the margin, did use the distribution. I think the mistake is that we all too often confuse education and information dissemination. So radio and TV is great for information dissemination, but the real learning happens by people interacting, by people getting practice, by people doing feedback, and et cetera, et cetera. And so that's where the internet's interesting, because it's the first mass media that's two-way. It's the first mass media that's actually interactive. Most of Khan Academy, even though people associate us with the videos, most of our resources are on the interactive side of things. How do you give practice? How do you give assessment? How do you give data so that teachers and districts can keep track of what's going on? And then how do you use that assessment eventually to give credit? Now the question about who's going to be able to, like you have big internet, big social media, big all of this. Look, this is one of the reasons why I set up Khan Academy as a not-for-profit back in 2007, 2008. It was delusional back then. I was one guy in a walk-in closet. But I said, maybe this could be a new type of institution. The same way that you have your great universities of the world, in the physical sense, maybe the internet could use institutions. I remember even when I was one guy in a walk-in closet, I had done the math. Even back then, I had reached more kids than Harvard had in its history. And Khan Academy is 100 to 1,000 times bigger today than it was then. So the opportunity for scale, but I think a lot of people in Silicon Valley don't think about institutions. Don't think, just as you need libraries and parks and museums and hospitals in the real world, what are the equivalent in the virtual world? Mm-hmm. And I'd like to think Wikipedia is an example. I'd like to think Khan Academy is an example of real institutions. So to your question about, big tech, and everyone's afraid of social media and polarization and fake news and young kids getting depressed looking at their feeds, I think this is where the not-for-profit sector is interesting. I wonder if you had a social media platform that was not-for-profit, how would its motivations be different? What if it had a different bottom line? Instead of saying, we want to raise our stock price, if it said, our bottom line is we want to increase the amount of interaction or happiness in humanity, they would do different things. Their algorithm would not give the most polarizing piece of information to keep you watching more ads. Instead, it would give So this is why I think it is important. There's a lot of very positive things that happens in for-profit ed tech, but I think it is important. There's certain pieces that you want it to be independent of. Look, I worked at a hedge fund. That's the most for-profit thing you can do. And I saw people's motivations. Even good people, at the end of the day, when your share price when your earnings per share are not doing what they need to do, you start making compromises to make it happen. And that's why I was, somewhat ironically, wanted this to be a not-for-profit venture, because I do think it's going to be a central institution going forward.
And you mentioned the internet as an interactive tech. So for those of us interested in ed tech, can you give us any clues as to whether extended reality, the metaverse, is going to play a role in the future of Khan Academy?
So people are surprised because a lot of folks associate me with technology, but I'll be the first person to say you should never lead with technology.
But you studied math and computer science, if I remember.
I studied technology. I'm a technology, whatever. But I always say you should lead with what the problem you're trying to solve is. We've seen this in education. We've seen this in everything. People say, let's drop an iPad into a classroom and cross our fingers and hope something. Nothing. The iPads are going to sit and gather dust. And things like this have been happening for the last 40 or 50 years. You have to start with what are the goals you're trying to solve. So for us at Khan Academy, there's a goal of access. How do you make sure that someone, I was telling a journalist earlier today, there's a gentleman in the US who was in prison for 15 years. He gets on Khan Academy. He's able to learn, and when he gets released at 31, he knew enough, he was able to transfer to Stanford University. So how do we give access to 1 billion people like that so that everyone has access to the best learning in the world? Another question, every teacher in the world knows, hey, I have 30 kids. They're all in different places. They all have different needs. How do I personalize to their needs? How do I give them all the opportunity, the incentive to master their content? That's another pedagogical goal. So how can you do it? Well, maybe technology can play a role here. So, people ask me about machine learning and the metaverse, and I say, okay, let's put the pedagogical goal first, and then think about what the solutions are. So, there are interesting questions. If you're creating an ed tech platform like Khan Academy, how can you give the right nudge to the student at the right time? Maybe machine learning could play a role there. So maybe we can detect when a student is about to give up and say, give them a motivation right then. That's cool. We've been talking to the folks at Meta, brainstorming what we could do, but we started with the pedagogical. I was like, well, in physics, you learn Newton's laws. And when you learn Newton's laws, you learn about an object will stay in motion? Well, but wait, that doesn't happen on Earth. Well, because of air resistance and friction and all of this. But what if you're able to put yourself in deep space? And you have a game where you have to float that way. So you throw an object this way, and you're just like, oh, look, now I'm drifting this way. That would give kids intuition. I was suggesting, let's create an Oculus app where the speed of light isn't 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second, it's 30 meters per second. And so you can conceptualize, you can live in a relativistic world. You can start to see relativistic velocities. So I think there's applications, but we shouldn't force it. It should come from a place of need as opposed to technology first.
I'm smiling because before you said that your friends told you they liked you better in video than in person. So I wonder in the future if they're going to say they like you better in Meta than on video. We'll see.
You never know. Never know.
We'll see. So let's turn to crystal ball. And so let's go out a bit though. Let's not go 5 years. Let's go maybe 10 years out.
Okay.
And I would love to know. I think we'd all love to know what if I'm a learner who cannot afford premium education. Okay, so I don't have the funds to access it. What is education going to look like for me, do you think, in 10 years? I know that's far out, but...
No, 10 years is, that's the right time frame, I think, to be thinking about. You know, Khan Academy right now, we're reaching 140 million learners. There's 55 localization projects around the world. There's 55 languages of Khan Academy. But as we know, the need is we're talking about billions of folks. So if we go 10 years, and I don't think this is a prediction, I think this is what we're working on. This will happen. In every major language in the world, you will have all of the core academic material from pre-K through the core of college. That one, you know, hold me accountable to that. Hopefully other people do that too. And the Khan Academy is much more than me now. We're a big team. But that is going to happen, for sure. It's already happening, but in the next 5, 10 years. On top of that, when you get mastery on a platform like Khan Academy, it's going to result in credit. And I think this is the big deal, because we're already doing pilots now where students are getting mastery on Khan Academy, and they're getting college credit for free. And so I think in the next 10 years, you will be able to get your core of college for free on platform like Khan Academy. And I'll also argue, if you can actually master your first 2 years of college, so your biology, your chemistry, your history, your English, or your writing, or your Spanish, whatever it might be, and you've mastered it, not just sat in a class, you've mastered it, you are actually you're more educated than most people who sat in a lecture hall for 4 years. And if you gave them the test, they might forget a lot of the material. So I actually think that is going to be one of the hopefully, major changes. The other one is we have another platform called schoolhouse.world, which is about free tutoring. And the way we're able to give people free tutoring over Zoom is by leveraging volunteers. And I think the credential of the future is going to be your reputation as a tutor. Already, universities like MIT, like University of Chicago, they're admitting kids based on not their scores in calculus or in statistics, but how good they can tutor other kids in calculus or statistics on schoolhouse.world. Because if you can do that, you know the material, but you also can communicate, you can empathize, you have patience, you're giving to other people. And if that becomes the credential of the future for college or for internships, I think we're going to be in a good place.
And so, I mean, just to add to that, so you and I, we missed each other at MIT by 2 years. We were lucky to have access to premium education from top universities. I'm at IE now. You went to Harvard Business School as well. So these are great schools, right? And so is that prediction that you made, does that change for what learners are going to experience 10 years from now who are able to go to top universities?
I think that there will be, for sure, a place for in-person, place-based education, but it needs to focus on the human interaction. For too much, they focused on the big lecture hall, one professor giving a lecture to 300. They have to say, and the pandemic taught us, when human beings are in the room together, make them integrate, make them interact with each other. Our best memories of college weren't the lecture halls. Our best memories of college were sitting in the dorm room, talking to our friends, daydreaming about what the world should be like. Don't make that the sideshow at the university. Make that the centerpiece, and then these universities will be just fine.
So it's all about the experience.
It's about the experience.
Okay, so we're just about out of time, so I wanted to ask you one last question, just for those of us interested in education, working in education. So if you had to capture it in just a few sentences, for you, what is the mission of education?
The mission of education is to empower humanity, make sure as many people as possible can actually fulfill their potential and can contribute and lead a happy life. It's that simple.
And that's what we've seen you dedicated.
That's what hopefully we can play a part.
So thank you for that. And thank you to Sal Khan.
Thank you.